Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight. We have been really excited about this meeting. This is the meeting of the year for us. We've been really excited to have Dr. Tony Dale join us. I think everybody here kind of knows who Dr. Dale is, so I won't go too into the background. But founder of Sedera, and just overall, in my mind, a healthcare visionary that hopefully tonight can help us just be more excited about an understanding of the job we have to do in changing healthcare for the better. So we'll have some time throughout for questions, but you'll want to put your questions in the chat if you're online here, and then we will field them as they go. Without any other, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I just want to welcome everyone to our headquarters here. Just a few housekeeping things. Restrooms are just down and to the right here if you need them. We still have food and things out here, so please feel free to eat that. Otherwise, it's going to invite little rodents and insects, and we're trying to keep the place clean. So, do your part, please. Very excited to have everyone here. And certainly to have Dr. Dale here as well to, I got a chance to listen to Dr. Dale, the Free Market Medical Association this year, and not a physician myself, I'm a physical therapist by training, but nonetheless, just how inspiring his path, but more importantly, his path forward, and the things that we need to do to kind of take back our profession of healthcare from those things out there and bring it into this room of providers and people that actually care. So very excited to have you. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Come on up here, and you should be able to share screen if you want to go.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to come. Do you need me to do anything on the technology side? Okay, great. It's a real honor to be invited to come and share with you. And I love what the Free Market Medical Association is doing to really propagate many of the ideas that are going to be at the backbone of things I talk about tonight. I'll give you a little bit of my journey. An expert, the definition that I've remembered best is an expert is someone who knows more and more about less and less until he knows everything there is to know about nothing. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of, I guess, in that category, meaning we're all learners in this world. And if I could have imagined this British family doctor who was, coming over from the UK, I came over here not to practice medicine. At that stage, I'd helped pioneer essentially a faith-based movement among physicians, really helping them begin to think in terms of how to integrate treating the whole person. As a family doctor by background, let me just get rid of this little note there. As a family doctor by background, and not just by profession, but by family. My dad was a family doctor. His dad was a family doctor before him. Some of my youngest memories are going out on house calls with my dad. And because we lived out in Taiwan where he had, gone out to pioneer some work over there, basically all of the expatriate community were his patients. He was really virtually the only foreign doctor in Taiwan back there in the sort of early 1950s when I was born. So his patients ranged from the poorest of the poor, literally coming off the street into free clinics that he ran, to, the British ambassador. And I loved going to the British ambassador's house because it was an old fort on the edge of the coast and where a river estuary came out from the capital city, Taipei. And these magnificent grounds that they had, and the sort of obligatory Rolls Royce for a British ambassador. We would go out there and, and sometimes it was the middle of the night. He'd wake me up and say, hey, why don't we just go? We can chat while we're talking stuff. I'm a little kid loving this. And, seeing the amazing sort of life that a doctor can have and the extraordinary respect that they have with their patients and his respect for the patient, whoever they were, whether they were the ambassador or the homeless person off the street. And I began to capture a picture of what it was like to care about the whole person. And so that really shaped me. And, you know, going through medical school, you know, in London at Barts Hospital, love to mention for, you know, all of my American friends, which of course I'm now an American, although it took me 20 years before I finally got off the fence and said that I was going to become American, having lived here on my green card for all of that time. But, you know, we view history over on the other side of the pond slightly differently. Now, you may not realize it, but I think all of you have seen the hospital I trained at. You might say, well, I've never been to London. No, but I think probably you've all seen Braveheart, the movie, yes? Okay, well, in pretty much the final scene where he's hung, drawn, and quartered, you know, maybe the ladies covered their eyes, it's getting too brutal or something. But there's a plaque on the hospital wall that says, at this spot, William Wallace was hung, drawn, and quartered. And the hospital had already been in existence for 300 years when that happened. It was established in 1123. So, you know, for me, coming from that sort of background with, I actually have up on the Sidera, I think it's on the Sidera office wall. It might be on the Curious Group wall where you know, the first company I started. But it's a certificate that my grandfather won at the same hospital. And it's fascinating, you know, that here's this distinguished hospital. But in those days, the days being 1901, I guess they were so cheap that, or printing was so difficult, I don't know which, but they had pre-printed certificates for whoever won the annual anatomy exam. And it said 18, and then you filled in which year. But this was 1901, so they just crossed out the whole thing, and they've written in by hand 1901. He won the anatomy scholarship that year. So I guess there was some strong family genes, but not in terms of the study of anatomy. Because when I'm there in medical school, you know, essentially 70 years later, I also went in for the anatomy exam only because I knew that my grandfather had won it. And I thought it'd be great fun. I'm not an anatomist. Part of that is I don't even know how to draw a stick figure correctly. If I play Pictionary with the kids and the grandkids, everybody wants to be on the same team as me because my drawings are so bad, it creates hilarity for everybody in the room. So, you know, something like anatomy where you need to be able to draw and diagram, you know, what's going on, definitely was not my scene. But I thought it'd be fun to try it. Anyway, I go in and, you know, here's this cadaver and they pull out something and they ask me what it is and I don't have a clue. And I sort of say, is it a gallbladder or whatever? Now, this is like a scholarship exam. And the professor looks at me and he says, Dale, now in England, you know, in polite or formal, like academic company, you call people by their last name. So, you know, I'm Dale. He said, Dale, you're just here for the beer, aren't you? And I've never forgotten that remark. I actually don't even like beer particularly, but it was a very accurate description of as me as a scholar. No, what I was really there for was the tennis and for the beautiful young lady that I met on her first day at medical school, who I've now been married to for 50 years. And I just got back a couple of weeks ago from a wonderful honeymoon in Ireland in the exact same cottage that we had our honeymoon in as medical students who were penniless and were gifted this cottage for a week when we got married. So lots of interesting memories, but of course that has nothing to do with anything we're talking about tonight. But I guess it establishes that when you come from a long tradition, whether it's the sort of British sort of medical establishment or, you know, the family sense of what it means to really care about patients. You care and you notice when you see things going wrong. And, you know, for me, working in the British National Health Service, which is completely different, obviously, it's a socialized system. It's, if you like, a foretaste of what could easily be around the corner for this country if we don't wake up and understand the challenges of the sort of Medicare for all language. And I think it's worth making a comment here that the genius of describing things simply is that people can sort of hang their hat on it. Now, if you ask most people how they find Medicare in practice, they'll say, well, it's sort of adequate, but I think 80% of people on Medicare have Medicare supplements or use a Medicare Advantage plan or whatever, because it's not adequate. It doesn't do the job. Okay, and even those have their gaps and problems. So to believe that the panacea for something that's gone wrong, I mean, this is back to the old Einstein quote, isn't it? That the sort of level of thinking you needed to get into the problem is highly unlikely to be the level of thinking that's adequate to get you out of it. And so for us to give over to the government a massive conglomerate of industries, everything you might describe within the sort of medico-industrial type complex, and to think that they're going to do better than what they already do with Medicare or Medicaid or TRICARE or whatever it might be. I think it's the classic, the blind leading the blind. And of course, you know the end of that particular proverb. It says, if the blind lead the blind, they'll end up both falling into the ditch. And so I think the sort of thing that all of us are grappling with and engaged in is tremendously important. Dr. Kendrick and I were talking on the way from the airport that we're all learners. We feel typically that we're on our own, and is there anyone else doing anything like this? And am I doing it all wrong? And is it working? And in terms of the stuff I find myself involved in, there's so much regulatory involvement and oversight. It's like you wonder if you just step wrong, who's going to come down on you next and tell you that you're not doing it the way it's supposed to be done according to the box, that little checkbox that has to happen. And so there are a lot of challenges when you're looking at how do you really reform a system. But I think there are some simple concepts here that if we touch on before I show a few slides in terms of what's going on sort of in this emerging free market medical ecosystem, and as we think about what it's going to take to really bring transformation. How many of you have read the book, The Diffusion of Innovation? Clayton Christensen, I think, being the author. Doesn't matter. Very, very well-known book about sort of innovation. And it has a very famous curve in it, at least I believe it's in this book, called The Diffusion of Innovation. And it's sort of a Gaussian distribution curve, for those who can remember any of their mathematics. A Gaussian distribution curve is basically a population curve. It shows what happens in standard populations. And so when it comes to innovation, there are very few who are the pioneers, maybe 1 to 1.5% of people who naturally fall into the sort of sphere of sitting in a meeting like this, of thinking about how can we change things for the better. The typical doctor, again, we were comparing notes. I didn't have one lecture, not one, in medical school on the business side of medicine. Okay, now maybe part of that was because it was all owned by the government anyway, so there was nothing anyone could do about it. But even in that context, you have to know how to run a business and take care of your staff and all sorts of things that are going on. So absurd that you could be trained to that level and actually have no fundamental understanding of basic business principles. In my case, going back into the late 60s and early 70s when I was in medical school, I also didn't have one lecture on nutrition. I mean, that's almost unbelievable. Computer language, garbage in, garbage out. Well, it's no different in health. And you begin to look at, the massive spread of Western style diseases. And it's because we haven't taken a holistic view. Medicine has typically been focused on pathology. And so our health systems are terribly misnamed because they're actually sickness systems. It isn't just that the system is sick, which I would say in this country and in many countries it is in so many ways. Okay, but it's focused on sickness and hasn't, why on earth would you put your ambulance at the bottom of the hill for people to fall over the cliff and you can cart them off to hospital if you could just build a fence up at the top and prevent them falling off the cliff to start with? And so, in healthcare, we have to begin thinking about what it's going to take so that we can really bring people towards health and the incredible impact that that has on cost overall. So when you're thinking about innovation, and you begin to understand the sort of innovation curve and why there's so few people who are naturally inclined towards innovation, one of the concepts you begin to understand is that actually innovation hardly ever comes from the top. It's not likely to come from big hospital systems or from major insurance companies or from, or from the government or from, massive systems of any type. Because the larger an entity becomes, the more the inertia of the organization and the fact that they've already built a profitable model means that they probably don't want to interfere with what's already working. And I'm guessing many of you have read Marty McCary's The Price We Pay. Yeah, I see a fair number of heads. If you haven't read it, I think it's the best book out there for peeling off the layers of the onion and beginning to realize that we really find ourselves unwittingly in a context that's honestly become corrupt. It's not just that it's bad or that there's greed, any and all of those things I'm sure are true. But somehow the system itself has morphed into something which is perfect for what the system wants to do, which is separate the patient from their money. And in all sorts of ways, separate the patient from their physician. Because when you follow the money trail at the most simple level, a lot of us here happen to be doctors. Most of the doctors in the United States are basically owned by one of the large systems, either the hospital systems or private equity systems. And so, once you become primarily a referral source to take people from, shall we say, patient-based medicine, which can actually be handled very effectively in an exchange of value, which is what free market economics is all about, in an honest and open and transparent way, into a situation where, like I was, as an agent of the government over in England. Now, I didn't understand all these things. I was there with all the best of intentions, but I didn't understand that basically I was at the beck and call of a government that would limit, because you cannot give everything to everybody that they want in healthcare, because people always want more and more and more. No system can handle that. Okay, and so you have a bottomless sort of pit of need. But you always, in any context, you have limited resources. So the way that you limit it in a Medicare for All or the British National Health Service is that you primarily limit it by access and by waiting lists. Now, how that works in practice isn't the sort of context that we described tonight, but to mark the contrast in the system. If I sent someone for an MRI, well, they didn't have MRIs in those days, but let's say for a complex sort of X-ray, there might be a 3-month wait. I remember when I took my mom, who had by then moved over here for her sort of final few years, or Felicity and I looked after her. I took her when it looked like she probably had, crushed one of her vertebrae. And I just remember still being so shocked at that. And this was, I guess this was about 2008, something like that. We were at the orthopod's office, and he said to my mom, he said, well, look, we have MRI facilities in the building, but I don't know, you might have to wait a few hours before we got it done here. But it'd be easy for me to call up and arrange for you to have an MRI done tomorrow at a location that's near you. So would you rather wait here for a few hours or have it done tomorrow morning? And my mind is whirring, and I'm saying this is unimaginable in England, even in 2020. It's just, it's inconceivable. It would probably still be a 3-month waiting list for the MRI. And then, it'll be read and interpreted and sent off, might get back to the orthopedist or whoever, the neurosurgeon, whoever's going to be involved, a month later. And then you'll get a note about when you can have an appointment. And that might be 3 months down the road. And then the surgery will be scheduled for 3 months after that. I mean, we have no idea the sort of luxury, if I can call it that we enjoy and which we take for granted, and which is a product of at least a semi-free market system. Okay, now it's not ideal because there's so many entities that are interfering with it. We need to bring it back towards the roots of the power of the free enterprise system to deliver quality, which is always going to be measured by the value that is received by the patient. I think it was Keith Smith I heard speaking, and he was talking about when, he first testified. I think he was talking about Congress in DC as opposed to at the state level in Oklahoma, where he is. Keith Smith of Surgery Center of Oklahoma. Most of you can probably know of him. And he was describing how they can do it so much cheaper and whatever than what the hospitals are doing, even while paying the doctors more and having metrics that are better than their local hospitals in terms of lack of infections and this type of thing. And one of the legislators says to him, "Yeah, but so what's going to happen to your system when someone sets up just next door to you at half the price of you?" Thinking that like he's now stumped Keith Smith. And Keith Smith says to him, "Well, I think we're getting somewhere if Congress is asking me questions about what do we do when we're already at a third of what other people's price is, and we're going to have to live competitively with someone who chooses to do it at half the rate we're doing it at. This is a good problem for us to have, Mr. Congressman." Okay, now these are the types of issues that we need to grapple with. So with innovation, it nearly always comes from the bottom, from the grassroots. I brought some copies of the book I've recently read. I apologize, I don't have enough copies. I hadn't realized how many of us there would be here tonight. But obviously you're welcome to buy it on Amazon, but I'm leaving these with Dr. Kendrick. Any of you are welcome to take one. But the only prerequisite, I say, is if someone's going to take it for free, I need to know that you're committed to reading it and that it goes at the top of your reading list, not at the bottom. Because things that we put on our reading list, like I've got a pile beside my bed that has a tendency to get taller, the ones on the bottom might be there for a very long time before they get discovered. So you're welcome to take one, but my request is it's at the top of the list as you're saying, yeah, this is worth taking and I'm gonna read it. Okay, the thesis in that is that if we look at the extraordinary amount of innovation that's already happening, and if we begin to apply some of the sort of insights, okay, that the market itself will allow us to find ways that we can scale the things that are going on in such a way that they really will become transformational. And when you think about trying to transform a system, the key, okay, is that you find a way to diffuse the ideas that are transformational, which is why I wrote a book. The pen is mightier than the sword. You can go up and fight the system. I have a businessman friend who was thinking, who owns an enormous amount of stuff, including in the medical world, who was thinking he could change it by owning parts of the system. And he began to realize as he talked with me and with others, particularly, those who are right in there like yourselves, who are still very, very involved in the clinical world, that if you want to change things, ultimately it's going to become change between individuals. It's going to be altering how people respond, because until people begin to take responsibility for their health, while they still think that either you as the doctor always has a magic potion or that the government has the answer or something like that, it doesn't get to the place of them saying, well, I'm going to change my diet, or I'm going to take some exercise, or I'm going to do all of the other ordinary, very basic common sense things, which are at the root of dramatically changing the global cost for healthcare. If you take something like the taxi industry, can you imagine if a committee in Congress had been asked to find a way to make taxis work better? What it took was 2 software engineers from Silicon Valley to be caught in the rain in Paris and to say, we can't get a taxi just when we need one. There must be a better way. And they go back to San Francisco and they chew on this for a while and they come up with this crazy idea called Uber. And all of a sudden, something is so overwhelmingly better that you can disrupt the whole system. Even though all the odds are stacked against you, they have regulatory problems in every city. Of course, the taxi unions hated them. You know, the whole license or medallion system was, you know, being threatened by this. But the overwhelming success of just the basic idea that ordinary people like you and me said, this is easier. It works better. And I even know who the taxi driver is. I know his license, but I know how long it's going to take before he arrives here where I'm waiting. I feel safer. I don't mind telling my wife to, you know, take an Uber home. That feels really safe. So we are in the process, I would say, of saying, how do we bring innovation and change into a complex system? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a few slides. If any of you were at the FMMA sort of national conference in Dallas just a few months ago, then you know, most of the stuff I'm showing here in that sense will be familiar. But I think we'll be able to move really to any area that you want us to move into once we start dealing with Q&A. So let me get rid of this. Oh my goodness, what have I done? I made, oh, here we are. Great. Okay. Oh, but I don't like having this thing here. Let's move that and see if we can move it over to be vertical. If anyone knows how to make it vertical, they can tell me, but other than that, it doesn't matter. It's not going to be a problem. And I'm presuming people at a distance can see that. That's working. Okay, great. I want us to think in terms of what would happen if we can take the sort of ideas that we're exploring here and massively expand it. Most of you, maybe even without thinking about it, are small business owners. Okay, and there are millions of small business owners around the country. Oh, please behave for me. What do I have to do to make you do what I want? Here we are. Okay, 30 million of us, small business owners. Typical practice, business like this, physical therapy operation. I have no idea how many employees. Let's say 50 scattered in here. How many?
450.
450. Not all in this little space. No, scattered all over the city. Yeah, okay. So this has moved from a small business to a medium-sized business. And, you know, if we begin to think of how we get ideas across to people, the first thing you do is you commit to the idea yourself. Okay, change begins with us. And you're going to find that theme throughout the book that, you know, I have so many people say to me, oh man, Tony, these ideas are so good and I love the stories you tell. And I say, well, have you thought about introducing it into your own company? Oh, well, you know, all of my staff are so used to the system. And I say, yeah, absolutely. But the system changes when we change. We become the change that we're looking for. We pioneer things. We're willing to take risks. You know, one of the stories you'll read in there, Kristen Dickerson is a radiologist in Houston, founder of Green Imaging. Have any of you come up? A few of you know about Green Imaging. She had a great idea back around 2010. She said to herself, you know, there's a huge amount of surplus capacity in imaging. So, you know, the MRI that is in the freestanding radiology unit or in the hospital, it has the capacity to perhaps do 8 MRIs in a day, you know, with a technician or 2 who are looking after the equipment. But it's maybe only doing 5 instead of 8. It's not working at capacity, and Priceline had become very big. And she said to herself, we could use the Priceline model. We could find a way to take surplus capacity, which is what Priceline did with hotels and airlines and the like. And if we can help the people who have that surplus capacity make it available, for them it's just going to be pure profit because both the technician and the equipment is just sitting there. Their basic costs are already set. They've already got a profitable model. We can now offer them something, but it doesn't need to be at whatever exaggerated prices they have. Because again, I think almost everybody who's a part of today knows that you can go one side of the street and pay $3,500 for your MRI, and you can go the other side of the street and pay $350. Okay, that's a tenfold difference for exactly the same thing. And that is right the way through the medical system. Okay, I mentioned the Surgery Center of Oklahoma, the typical surgery there at about 1/3 the price of the same operation being done by the same surgeons in other hospitals in Oklahoma City. How can we justify it? Imagine if you went to buy a car and you understood, because you had been told that the only place you're allowed to buy a car because you live in sort of Southwest Austin or Southeast Austin, is this particular dealership, and you can buy your car there for $100,000. And then you discover that if you happen to have lived elsewhere, you could have bought the same car for $35,000. I mean, you're going to feel cheated. And the whole medical system is in the process of cheating people all the time by keeping them ignorant, by having everything translucent rather than transparent, by making it impossible for people to understand through the complexity of the system how they can get the sort of value that they should be able to get. So she took this great idea from Priceline and said, we can apply it to radiology. And here, 10 years later, she's got something like 1,400 outlets around the country, with approaching 1,000 just in Texas, where people can get a fair price, a cash price on an MRI or any other radiology. And it's all going to be read by her firm, by high-powered, skilled, board-certified radiologists, wherever the actual diagnostic test itself is done. And other people are now copying that model. That's what we want. It's not like we've got to gather all this and somehow become absurdly wealthy ourselves. Okay, there's plenty of room here. There's a system that costs the nation $4 trillion at the moment. That's a lot of money. And most of us involved in that system basically feel that the reality is, if we could squeeze the waste out of it that we're describing here, that what would happen in that context is these employees, the ordinary people around the country that we're working with, or the hard-working gig economy workers and others who aren't necessarily in an employee-employer relationship, they have access to something that's fair and transparent and actually brings them higher quality. Okay, so most Americans right now support the concept of Medicare for all. Okay, what that means is most people are saying, we know the system is broken, and this concept, maybe the government does need to just take it over. The free market hasn't really done a very good job. Well, the free market barely exists in medical care. Okay, but most people don't understand that. And so the language of bumper stickers is, here's something that is going to be available to everybody. You've only got to look at where it's already being used around the world to know that there are significant challenges. Doesn't mean that there aren't some advantages. It's foolish to pretend. So for example, in Britain, I never saw a person who lost their home because of medical bills, ever. It didn't take long before I'd been over here to meet people who had literally lost their home. Did you know that 50% of bankruptcies in America have a major medical component as a part of that bankruptcy? Okay, but here is an even more shocking statistic. Of that 50% that have a major medical component, 85% of those had major medical insurance. Meaning we have a nation that have been sold a lie that having insurance means that you have access and that you have protection. No, you don't. You don't, okay? The vast majority of people who go into bankruptcy due to medical stuff had major medical insurance, but are functionally uninsured. Okay, when you have a $5,000 deductible as an individual and maybe 10 as a couple, and 15,000 as a family, or whatever it might be, or if you go out of network inadvertently and all of a sudden your copay For those things doubles from 20% to 40%, and the bills maybe with no limit, there may be no out-of-pocket limit or whatever. You're in a context where medical care can do a huge amount of damage. And for, most of us as physicians believed that we were there to help people. And then you start talking to physicians who use language to me as we've talked through these areas. I realized that I was helping my patients medically, but I feel like I've become a serial financial killer of my patients. And we're a part of a system that needs to be altered. Okay, so, the concept of a Medicare for all is real easy to understand. And I could tell you so many business leaders I've spoken to who basically say, oh, well, Tony, I don't even want to hear it. Why don't you just talk with my broker? Because this is too complicated for me to understand. That's why I have a broker. And I say, well, you need to understand who pays your broker. And they look at me and I say, well, don't I? And I say, well, you tell me. When did you write a check to him? Well, I guess I never have. He's paid by the insurance company. Well, then who does he work for? Does he work for you or does he work for the insurance company? So, these are questions we have to start asking ourselves. And when you do that, and, here, this is a comment, this was research done by the Job Creators Network out of DC, which is a free market sort of think tank lobbying organization, that people really want the doctor-patient relationship, and they know it's gone out the window. At least in the family practice world, as I talk to friends and colleagues who are still involved in that area, and as I watched it with members of my family, the typical consultation is probably under 10 minutes, and at least 50% of the time, the physician is looking at his computer rather than looking at the patient. As someone who is trained, at least in the sort of British model, which is really strong on history and physical examination, that basically before you do any test, you probably already know what you're dealing with. You're only doing tests to confirm what you already suspect because you've taken the time to know the patient and to know what's going on. Okay, in that context, people love it when they can get back to a decent doctor-patient relationship. Okay, so the people that we want to reach, the people who need this, the ordinary people out there, okay, when do they think about healthcare? Well, once a year when they talk to their insurance broker about how much it's going up in cost this year. Or maybe if one of their employees or a family member gets sick. Okay, here's a key concept. Remember that the family of the business owner are probably on the same plan as the employees. And so the story that we have to learn how to tell is that we've got the best answer for you, Mr. Employee owner of a company, for your family, and that the great thing is this is available and can be shared with your employees. And so we're giving people not cheaper options. The story isn't that this is cheaper. It is cheaper. That's a consequence of a much better system. Okay, but the story is you're getting much higher value. Okay, healthcare is, as far as I know, the only industry in which there's an inverse relationship between cost and quality. Inverse meaning that the lower the cost, the more likely that you're getting high quality care. Now, we could go into sort of why that is. So, as you're thinking about how do you help people join your DPC practices, or how are we going to market these concepts further? We need to learn how to tell the story. A slogan like Medicare for All is a story. Now it happens to be a lie. Okay, if you look at the original writing of Medicare for All, I don't know what President Biden stands for exactly now. But in terms of the original understanding of Medicare for All, the first thing that the way the law was written, it would do, it would get rid of Medicare. Get rid of Medicare and get rid of private insurance. So Medicare for All actually begins with Medicare for none. and a blank slate for the government to do whatever it wants, at least in its original writing. Okay, so we have to learn how to tell a story that captures people. Now, you guys all know that I'm involved in Sedera, but I'm not going to really focus on how Sedera works, although if you want to ask questions. But when we're looking at changing a system, we have to think about changing the whole system. And, you know, this is just a quote that I love from when I came across it a couple of years ago, because it is so descriptive. This isn't a medical person. Timothy Snyder, the author of this book, is a historian, but writing on his own experience in hospitals here in this country, he said, we would like to think that we have healthcare that incidentally involves some wealth transfer. What we actually have is wealth transfer that incidentally involves some healthcare. Now, that is a damning statement if ever one heard one. And we do have a system that is brilliant at keeping people separated from their money. And so, you know, again, you know, graphs that all they're doing is telling pictures. You know, this is showing the difference between sort of overall inflation, earnings of people that we have, premium costs for families, and out-of-pocket deductibles. Because don't forget, it's not just premium cost.
Okay. Yeah, make it real low because it gets really.
Hi there. Anyone who's talking to someone else on the phone, listening to this, you'll help us if you mute your yourself. Thank you. We have to understand that the two sides of the health cost thing are not just what the employer is paying or what the premium costs, but the out-of-pocket costs for patients have become astronomical. Okay, and so we need to find a way to rectify that. Okay, this helps you understand why the problem is as bad as it is. I mean, this is actually the share price for United Health. Okay, and if you go back down to 1995, I think it was around about $8. And if you look now, sort of around about $400. Okay, at a time when the Affordable Care Act was supposed to bring us affordable care, what we've seen is an acceleration of this massive transfer of wealth into a system that has got no better. If anything, it's got worse. And, you know, these are the sort of things that I personally believe that we need to be indignant about. We need to find ways to say to the country, there are better answers. And I love this quote out of Fast Company: CEOs have a greater ability to make change than politicians, journalists, and religious leaders. And in the medical world, that's so true, because through an accident of fate, most Americans who are employed end up getting their insurance through their employer. And so we have this weird situation of the employer as a middleman in the system, something that ideally we would change because it's not appropriate, it's not fair. There's nothing about being an employer that makes you somehow an expert in what's best for your employees. You know, people need to be able to make their own choices, and there are really good ways. For some of you who perhaps aren't so aware of what's going on out there, you know, something like the ICHRA, the Individual Choice Health Reimbursement Arrangement, is a magnificent tool to take a company from small, medium, or large out of the healthcare business, still funding the healthcare, okay, but making the choices available to the employees so that they begin to see that they have options. And when employees see options, you know, such as access to direct primary care, such as something like, you know, the Sedera medical cost sharing approach to handle the big stuff, such as the emerging growing number of specialists who are finding ways that they can handle things in a virtual care sort of manner and still give the same quality of care, but dealing with the ongoing sort of more complex cases. Just all sorts of tremendous things going on, and that works within the employer context. You just need CEOs who would say, my goodness, if I can give better care to my employees at half the price, then I can also improve my bottom line, and I can put a lot of this money back into their wage packet. And the ICHRA becomes a great tool for doing things like this. where we stop this ridiculous wealth transfer that isn't actually giving people better care. So kind of part of what I feel is my burden as I communicate is we need to find a way to help CEOs all over the country, whether it's a CEO of a family, which in most families for healthcare is the wife, the person who's going to make the decision, help her to understand this is better. They can have 24/7 access to a family doctor, you know, some sort of DPC environment of a doctor they know by name and who knows them by name. And if you start looking at sort of medical care and you look at cost benefit analysis, if people have a DPC doc, a VPC doc, it makes a huge difference. In Sedera, for example, we've found that the overall medical costs are so much lower for people who come to us via a DPC or a VPC doc that we can afford to drop their Sedera cost almost to a level where the drop in price is enough to cover their access to the DPC doc. And so now all of a sudden, I mean, we're essentially now doing everything we can to help everybody who comes to us find both a DPC or VPC type relationship, as well as what they do with Sedera, because we can give it to them for the same price essentially. But the DPC side is going to take care of 80% of people's needs in the medical system. It really is. So that only leaves the other 20%, which is even borderline likely to bring them to a place where under our model, you know, they're going to reach what we call their initial unshareable amount, the amount that they're going to pay out of pocket. We've designed it deliberately where they have an amount they pay out of pocket in every new need, because we want them to have skin in the game. Okay, now it's a very low amount. They can choose their own amount based on what they think that they can afford. That will affect how much they then, you know, pay in monthly shares, which is appropriate because you're trying to follow sound economic principles. But the philosophy behind that is, I worked with patients in you know, my London practice for years who didn't have any skin in the game. Oh, they could afford to buy a video out of the equivalent of Redbox. It wasn't around in those days, but you know, they'd go down to Blockbuster or whatever it was, and they could buy a video every night on the way home if they wanted to. They could buy a pack of cigarettes. Vast majority of my patients were smokers. I lived in that sort of section of London that was very poor, and people perhaps had no help on understanding their health. So they could afford their £5 for a pack of cigarettes, but they couldn't afford a penny for medical care. So they didn't think about it. And they didn't take good care of their relationship with people like me who are trying to help them. And they often didn't bother to follow any sort of regime of bringing real meaningful care into their lives. Okay, we have to deal with the basic issues if we're going to change the system. And so what I guess I want to encourage tonight, and I'll stop here because I'm the sort of guy who can tell you stories and bore you for the rest of the night. But, you know, assuming that maybe there's some questions, I'll gladly answer questions. But I guess the underlying thing I want to somehow get across is don't think we're going to change the system without getting engaged. Every one of us has to get engaged. And we have to teach people how to get engaged, because in that environment, we become, you know, partners in the process of bringing people into health rather than just managing the crisis every time they get sick. So thank you for listening. I hope you found some things here that are helpful, and whether it's online where you know, Dr. Kendrick, if you want to bring those questions, or anyone who's here, if you want to stand up and speak out a question, would be happy to sort of field some questions. And of course, I don't have all the answers. I'll be happy to tell you where I've got nothing to say. If any of you have something you then need to say, it's fine with me. So Kendrick, how do you want us to go from here? Are there any questions that you want to raise?
I have a question.
Okay. I guess for the sake of the people listening, either speak really loud and clear or keep it brief enough that I can repeat the question.
So the question I have for you is about, you mentioned that it would be better employers were not middlemen.
Yes, I mentioned that it's better if employers are not a middleman in the healthcare system. So carry on.
And you as a business owner who has business built around the fact that employers are middlemen. A health party business. Do you see that changing?
Again, if I can remind people, or maybe it's internal here. We think it is. Okay. Remember to be muted unless you're actually speaking. Yes, carry on.
Do you see that changing? Do you see that any evidence that we might get employers out of the healthcare business?
Okay, the question is there any evidence out there that employers are beginning to understand it may be wiser to them to be sort of out of the healthcare business?
No.
Or
Do you know if there will likely be legislation?
likely to be legislation moving in that direction? Okay, I think legislation will come, but I have no idea how far down the road it is. The necessary legislation, or at least executive order, has already been put in place. And the definition of the ICHRA, this individual choice health reimbursement arrangement, already provides a mechanism for the employer to say, I'm allocating a certain amount of money to each of you, employees, I love you, I want to help look after you, but you decide how that money's used. And based on your own choices, there's going to be more money around in the company that we can put straight into your wage packet. Historically, this all began at the end of World War II when the government was putting in wage and price controls. As typically happens with most legislation, there are unintended consequences. And one of the unintended consequences was that a huge amount of how an employer could give value to the employee all of a sudden became tax advantaged if they gave it in the form of benefits. And so to hire the best employees, they're giving better and better benefits. And so a huge amount of what typically would be in an employee's wage packet became benefit instead. Okay, the consequence then with everything else that goes on is the government takes over more and more of healthcare, the prices go up for everybody. And now the only way most people could afford it is if the employer is paying most of the bill in a tax advantage way, because the law was not set up fair. The people who bought their own health insurance did not get that tax benefit from it. And so, there are fundamental flaws. And when you start looking at the philosophy, it's really appalling that the people who make the most money get the most benefit from a benefit because they're getting tax advantage on something when they're already getting the most money. The people with the least money are the most damaged by the system as it's currently set up in a tax framework. So much that's wrong. But if we wait for answers from Washington, will it take a generation to really change this? I have no idea. But there are things we can do now. And of course, for larger companies that think maybe in terms of self-insure framework under ERISA, there's a lot of flexibility of things that can be done there, a lot of creativity. As you talk with employers, and I hope we'll find time, personally, you and I, to talk some tomorrow. There are really creative ways that we can bring all of these innovations into companies, small, medium, or large, where they can get the benefits of what is emerging in the free market. But that's where you need CEOs who have the courage to say, why on earth would I take the number 2 line item on my profit and loss, which is benefits? So salaries is the highest thing in virtually every company. Maybe in a manufacturing company, it might be raw materials or whatever, but typically salaries is the highest and benefits is the next highest line item. This is an area, a line item that any company can probably slash its costs by 50%. That isn't a decision for the head of HR. The head of HR can make a decision whether I use Blue Cross Blue Shield instead of Humana, or whether it's time to switch to Aetna instead of Cigna, i.e. they're treating something as a commodity. And they don't get fired for making safe decisions. CEOs and CFOs should be thinking about what is the bottom line for the company and what is actually going to give the best care to my employees. And there the answers are radical. And, you know, if they read my book and I give the story of, say, Harris Rosen in Orlando and, you know, what happened with the Rosen Resorts, when he had this conversation with his insurance company 20 years ago now, and the insurance company basically said to him, there's nothing we can do about it. You know, this is just how the system works. Oh, he said, well, there's something I can do. And they said, well, what? And he said, well, I can fire you. But he didn't just fire them. He fired the system. He said, I can do better. And this guy running resorts, mostly, you know, let's call it very blue collar employees type thing, low wage employees, you know, the people you think this isn't going to work well with, just because they had a loving CEO who cared and who took a derelict building that they had been using as a child care place and turned it into a primary care clinic so that all of his employees and their families would have direct access to quality primary care. And overnight, he cut the costs that he was paying on healthcare in half just by taking a bold move. So yeah, the call is to join a movement that says, count me in, we can change this. So yeah, another question, Bill.
Can you talk about ICHRA and what it's, when you look at ICHRA, it says, hey, everybody gets an amount, here's your amount. When you look at a self-insured employer, you have the majority of the people paying for a minority of the healthcare for the high utilizers. How does an ICHRA differ from that? How do you take care of those people if they don't have the money out here?
Okay, the question for those who couldn't hear it is around ICHRAs and how you make sure, because in an ICHRA, every employee can choose what pattern they're going to have. And sort of, I mean, it's a deep and important question, but in simple terms, what about those who perhaps choose a non-insurance solution, and is there going to be enough money around in a company in a self-insured type framework or whatever to handle unexpected large costs? Well, you know, the insurance system is supposed to deal with the large unexpected stuff. It's supposed to. Okay, but health insurance has long since stopped being insurance in a classic use of the word, and has become a very expensive way of prepaying for needs that we know we're going to have. Okay, so what we have, if we move the analogy from health to say how we look after our cars, can you imagine what we would be paying for an oil change if we had the same system to pay for oil changes that we have to pay for going to see a doctor because I've got a sore throat? Okay, you know, you'd go for your oil change and they would tell you, well, I'm sorry, you've got to come back in 3 weeks because you haven't quite hit the 5,000 miles yet that is mandated by law. And we're also going to send in and get pre-authorization for this, which will probably be rejected because you haven't yet hit 5,000 miles. You know, make up whatever story you like. All of a sudden, you're paying $300 for an oil change instead of $30. Okay, we have to find a way to break that system. So the really important questions become, how do you deal with the large stuff? Is there money available? The answer is absolutely. Okay, people need a way to handle the big medical costs, but who said that the only way to deal with that is insurance? You know, part of the lie, as I tend to put it, is that by giving people insurance, we give them access. We don't. You know, people in the British National Health Service, they have the national insurance, but what access do they have? They might have to wait 6 months for something. So, great. I hope you find it a blessing. Great. So people, absolutely, and employees, you know, as an employer, I want to make sure all of my people are well taken care of. Within the ICHRA environment, I can help them either to move down the medical cost sharing path for the big stuff, so the sort of stuff that we do as a company in Sedera, or I can help them move into the insurance path if for any reason they would prefer to go that way. But I don't want anybody not going down any path and just thinking they're going to handle this out of their pocket. I can't force them because I want them to be a morally mature person. I mean, I could force them. That's what the government does. You know, the Affordable Care Act is one massive sledgehammer to say that if you don't do something the way the government says you're to do it, then we're going to hit you on the head financially. We're going to penalize you. I don't think that's the way to bring morally mature people to a place of better care. We give them the option of making choices. We do everything we can to help them make good choices. Ultimately, if they insist on making bad choices, they're going to carry some of the pain of that, although society will probably find a way to back them, as we should. Yeah, lots of questions here.
There's a guy named Smith who would like to ask me a question.
Okay, the Keith Smith? Keith? My friend, what are you doing on this call tonight? How nice to have you here. What do you want to ask?
Are you kidding me? I'm not going to miss one of the heroes talking, but I've got to push back, and I cannot allow you to give me credit for Lee Gross's great comeback in front of Congress when they said what will happen when somebody matches your prices or undercuts you, and he had that quick reply that you mentioned. Says, are you serious? Do you realize the conversation we're having? We're getting somewhere. I did have a similar conversation though, and this is funny. Hospital administrator asked me one time, "What will you do when I match all of your prices?" And I said, "Well, then we'll be competing just on quality, and then you're dead."
Did you all hear that?
Yeah.
Yeah, what an awesome response.
Well, great talk. I know everybody there knows they're in the presence of greatness. I had to tune in. It's always great to hear you talk.
Well, Keith, you're destroying my hat size, and I appreciate the kind remarks. Yes, someone else.
Yeah, just kind of a follow-up to that ICHRA question and even health sharing. So for employers, I think the cutoff's 100 or something, 100 or more employees. How do ICHRAs and health sharing, and even health sharing with DPC, fit into that kind of requirement for employers to have a certain minimum essential coverage?
Yeah, great question. This is now getting down into the weeds. Vital that a question like that's answered. I would say rather than trying to answer it poorly here, there's probably a broker friend, maybe even right here in the room, who could be a great answer for you. Absolutely, you can reach out to us at Sedera. We can answer you. You could, talk to Dr. Kendrick. 100%. He's very familiar with what we do. So there are excellent answers for employers of every size.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank
Yes.
Another question, a little more fundamental to success stories. Are you able to share a couple of success stories that are off the top of your head when it comes to using Sedera as an option that we can then share with our patients? Because that's one thing that I know is a big unknown when it comes to these health sharing plans. They're seen as this big nebulous service, and it's hard for us to know how quote unquote well they work. Although I do believe in them, it's nice to have some concrete success stories where we say, look, this is a patient who had an unfortunate cancer diagnosis or was in a bad traumatic accident. These kinds of things that we can point to and say, look, it works.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there are endless stories. So, we look after, I don't know, something like 1,400 companies and help them with their teams. So, we all need stories. The best story to start with is yourself, with your own team, with your own experience, with what you're hearing from your people of, by them being involved and having access to DPC, or, how Sedera helps them with their larger bills or something like that. I'm just a real strong believer in the power of personal testimony. And that's why I'm constantly challenging, business owners, do the experiment on yourselves and on what you control. And then you're not telling other people's story, you're telling your story. And in that context, it's very hard for anyone to contradict you. I mean, if you wanted to know sort of statistically, I could tell you, Bowtie Medical out of, near Cleveland, Ohio, that they managed an easily identifiable population of about 2,000 people. Because they're started by a research physician who's very used to the idea of statistics and everything else, they tracked stuff really, really carefully with this group. With those 2,000 lives that they were looking after, they already were charging them way less within the DPC sedarotype model. So they're starting with, let's call it a lower equivalent of premium cost. Although they're not using an insurance system, they're using a sharing system, looking after about 2,000 lives. I show a graph in the book at the end of 18 months, when they graphed out what they had done, their medical loss ratio, and don't forget they're already charging less because they've already designed the system to try and help. Their medical loss ratio was about 12.5%, meaning most of the money that had been paid in as monthly share was still sitting there waiting to be used, because the DPC system and navigating them through the complexities of the healthcare world was working so well for this particular group of 2,000 that the vast majority of the money was not needed. So at that point, you adjust your monthly share type thing. We work on similar patterns across, obviously a much bigger community made up of all sorts of people, so different geographical and population type distribution. But it's fascinating. We've been running at this stage for almost 7 years. I have to be careful of the language I use because we're not insurance. We're not allowed reserves. Reserves are what insurance companies do. We have zero reserves, which baffles people. But we actually have very large sums of money sitting in individual accounts for everybody because we never touch their money. It's always titled in their name. We are a sharing program. We help people share in a highly sophisticated fintech way, in such a way that we satisfy the regulator's desire that we can show that we never have the money, we have no access to it, we can't take it, but we do have ACH authority so that we can distribute it. Okay, and into that, we have a higher per what we call a primary unit, which is basically whoever the lead member is plus spouse or plus children type thing. And we have boundaries that we've discussed with the regulators, and they seem really happy because they tell us you can't have reserves, but you better be able to pay the big bills when they happen, or we're going to come down on you like it. This is typical world that one lives in when you're trying to bring in innovation. So thankfully, we found a legal and ethical way of doing that that's completely transparent. And we live with boundaries of the total amount we want to see available per primary unit. We actually, right now, after 7 years of paying every bill, and the last statistic I saw from our team says that our average bill is taking something like 16 days to pay. So faster than any insurance company that I'm aware of anywhere in the country. And with a net promoter score that is something like 79%. Okay, higher than Southwest Airlines, and who are fabled for their customer service. And we're not perfect, but we're trying our hardest, and it's obviously really appreciated by our teams in all the surveys that are done. With all of those things, we have this higher amount available through the sharing community than we've ever had in our 7 years. We're actually getting relatively close to the place where if it continues to climb like this, we'll just drop our monthly share so that we can give the money back to people in the form of lower monthly shares.
So it sounds like you answered my question even better. So they asked, you said that you say with a high degree of confidence, that you haven't had a bill out there, haven't been able to pay.
We've paid every bill.
That's
We
great.
paid every bill. Now, our guidelines are clear, what we do. And, so long as something is an eligible need, we pay it. Even when it's grossly inflated. And we're looking how we can bring, some of the large providers more to heel, because it is not appropriate or ethical that they take money from a community that is living responsibly, and they are irresponsible in how they want to charge. But those are just all part of the battles that one has to fight. But yeah, we've been able to pay every bill for every member. Yeah.
Our sister, our health innovation here is relatively young in Arizona. A bunch of DPC docs, but our overall ecosystem is very immature. Can you shed some light on where your Sedera or where you, like you said, Sedera kind of pairs with some DPCs in different regions, what a more mature system start to look like, so we can kind of say, all right, we need this next, or this is something we should be looking for. What do you see as a step in maturity of a innovative healthcare system?
Okay, that's just such a great question. And at the risk of boring you, let me describe just briefly one conversation that we're in the middle of, which would be like a whole bunch of conversations that are going on. Because if what we're going to do is going to catch the national attention, we have to be able to demonstrate that it works at scale. We have to have the statistics where, instead of me giving you anecdotes, stories, where we have verifiable statistics that the legislators and others can look at and say, my goodness, we not only shouldn't be making it difficult for these guys, we should be encouraging everybody to think about moving in this direction. So what are the types of things you have to do? Okay, well, if one's gonna really, I don't know, say you're talking about a large company, 10,000 employees, and they want to make sure that they're doing a really good job, especially in this market. With the great resignation going on, everybody's experiencing some of the impact of that. Seems to be huge numbers of people for social reasons who aren't sure if they want to work, and the government seems prepared to let a lot of people get away with that. Which is, again, kind of strange. All of these weird things that we're living in the middle of. Okay, so if we're going to demonstrate that it really works, we have to be able to show it works for every part of the system. So there's a city, I'm not going to say its name because it'll then become obvious, and not that I'd have any mind, but I don't want anyone else to feel that they maybe didn't see it exactly the way I've described it. But where we're talking, where there seem to be enough DPC docs who are looking after enough patients, and there are enough specialty docs who've been already talking with each other, saying, how do we actively cooperate with this direct cash pay model? And I think one of the exciting things that's emerging over the last couple of years is that specialists are trying to figure out the economics of how they can be available. I mean, say you're a rheumatologist, how does it work? Because you've got to figure out, do you charge people? Because most of what you're going to be doing is chronic illness. So, if you're an endocrinologist and you're looking after diabetics or something, as a primary thing, along with, of course, many other things, you're looking at a chronic care model. And now you're thinking, for the patient's benefit, how much of this could actually be handled by me as the specialist talking with you as the primary care physician, so that you're actually handling most of the chronic care, but with real easy access to me as the specialist to make sure that we're keeping right on top of it, right up to date with what are the best principles of care. So all of a sudden you're moving something that historically, the purpose of the primary care doctor was to, historically, I mean in the current system here, not real historically, just what's the corrupt system that's emerged, they become a funnel to put people into the expensive system. Now you have people in the expensive system saying, hey, we get this and we want our freedom back too. We love this idea of moving into a cash pay environment. Why don't we find a way to consult to you and let you handle all of the care that you're comfortable handling and that we're comfortable discussing with you. And only when it gets beyond a complexity that you feel comfortable with our advice handling, then you bring them on to us and we'll deal with them, but now in a fair and transparent way. So, these types of conversations we have to figure out at the grassroots level. And in this particular city, they've been talking around this for about 18 months. And there's now enough momentum, along with, the fact that we know the folk there well, both on the specialty side and on the DPC side, that with Sedera there to help them deal with the expensive stuff that moves beyond, let's call it ordinary specialty care, into something that has to move at the moment into the current hospital environment. We don't yet have real solutions for the current hospital environment, but at least it's being really well handled until it gets into that much more expensive system. Give this another 5 years, and I would not be at all surprised to see hospitals emerging or hospital systems that say we want to become part of the answer rather than part of the problem. And that's going to take real courage, because the people who own these things are getting so much money out of the system that it's corrupted their concept of why hospitals were there in the first place. I mean, especially the nonprofit hospitals are the worst, as Marty McCary sort of details in his book, The Price We Pay. We have to help change the thinking. It's one of the reasons why, we started what we do in Sedera within a for-profit model, and we were forced by the state of Texas, and we're happy to cooperate with regulators. We try and work with them because we got nothing to hide. We want to satisfy them, but we don't want principles to be wrong. We started in a for-profit model because it's actually much easier to be transparent. It's much easier to show exactly what you're doing. It's far more difficult to hide things in the books. When you bifurcate between the for-profit and the not-for-profit, you create the environment where I might get libeled if I mention names, but most of you would probably be aware of medical cost sharing or healthcare sharing ministries that have gotten huge trouble in the law in the last few years and caused trouble all over the country. And, one of them got very big, and I think the owners have fled the country now. And, this sort of stuff happens when well-meaning legislators try and put rules in place that ignore human nature and the fact that people are going to go out there and try and corrupt the system. So, into that context, we have to figure out ways to keep real pricing transparency open to everybody so that they begin to see these better systems emerge.
We better end the meeting officially, but I assume you might take a couple more questions after.
Yeah, and of course, those of you on Zoom, you can end the meeting anytime by just clicking off. So nobody needs to feel they need to say, and I agree with you. I'm sure we've gone way over time. I'll never be allowed back to Phoenix again. But please, of course, feel free to go. But I'm also quite happy to stay and answer a few more questions myself.
I don't know if this has been done in other places that you work with, but I get the impression that geography is important to attract your businesses to want to join the system. And there's also a pushback of the DPC doctors who get big as a group because that's what we got out of it, basically. But what is it? Is there any experience of a group of a loose organization of DPC doctors in Peoria, South Gilbert, Phoenix, Chandler, Scottsdale, that can loosely form something that would market for the small businesses to be attracted with a little connection with Sedera? How's that? Is that anybody?
That's such a good question again. There are some more formal arrangements than what you're describing. I'd know, say something like Freedom Health Works, where they've created a model, a system And because the two brothers who started that, both of their parents are doctors, so they're very, very aware and really did it to sort of help their parents and stuff. So, you know, I like seeing all sorts of different things emerge. So, but absolutely, we need systematic approaches to this stuff. So I don't think one can say there is one answer. What one can say is let's have all the answers out there that all of us come up with, and let's see which actually end up working best. So it'd be awesome if for example, I'm just sort of talking off the top of my head, but if a bunch of you as DPC docs in this city, along with any brokers that you currently worked with, who perhaps helped you bring companies so that helping you find patients type thing, wanted to get together and think about how could we do something that really impacted the greater Phoenix area. That would be such a fun conversation. 100%, I'd be out here, you know, in a flash to happily tell you and put you in contact with others who are doing similar things, so that we, generally speaking, in what's emerging at the moment, and Keith, if you're still there, I really take my hat off to you for the example you've given us all. You know, Keith has just shared what he's done in Surgery Center of Oklahoma with everybody. He hasn't taken the IP and said, this is my way to get wealthy. He's just made it available. I love it. And, you know, if there's a way that we can all share what we're learning, we can pull from experience so that we don't have to constantly be reinventing the wheel, and you create something here that's really good for Phoenix, and, you know, someone else creates something in Austin that's really good for Austin or whatever. This would be awesome. Just like there are 50 United States, which ideally would be a wonderful testing ground for all sorts of 50 different approaches to how to handle problems. You know, the free market does that. And so I would encourage you, don't just shelve the ideas, talk together. And if there's anything we can do to facilitate the conversation, we would love to help.
We invite all of it.
For those of you online, yeah, keep talking. Just a couple are talking back and forth about, are there lists of where all the DPC doctors are? And increasingly, those sort of lists are becoming available. So for any of you who are watching this, if you know Dr. Kendrick or the people organizing things in Phoenix, you can always reach out to them. You're also welcome to reach out to us at Sedera, and we're glad to help you in any way we can. So yeah, another question.
So what does Sedera do? There's a lot of cost shares out there. What does Sedera do that's unique or special, or that gives you an edge over some of the other cost shares that you're competing with?
Okay, I love that question. So the question is, so why Sedera? Why not any of the other cost shares? Well, my first answer would be some of the other cost shares are really good, really excellent. Medishare and Samaritan Ministries would probably be the first that come to mind. You could go back even to one that's older than either of those, now called Christian Healthcare Ministries. These are ethical groups that have done a good job in pioneering the concepts. And they have lots of members around the country. That the primary difference there, so I've not got anything negative to say about them as groups, but the primary difference, I actually tried to persuade a couple of those to become Sedera instead of starting Sedera, but couldn't persuade them. Because what I felt really strongly was that when you've got a really good solution, it needs to be available to everybody. And why, if the evangelical Christian community has a good solution to something, why would they agree to a government restriction in the Affordable Care Act that it would only be available to other evangelical Christians who could sign their statement of faith? No, this needs to be available to everybody. Now, I'm quite open. I'm an active Christian. My faith is core to everything I do, but it's because of my faith that I feel very strongly that what we're doing needs to be open to everyone. For those for whom, scripture is an important thing, it doesn't need to be to, for those that's not part of their framework, no problem. But for me, it's part of my framework. And, the typical thing I think of is like in the Psalms, it says, the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, the world and all who dwell therein. For he has established it. So I, as a Christian physician, feel an absolute obligation. My patients in the East End of London, they were 99% rank outright proud of being heathens. And that's wonderful. It's a real privilege to serve them and to bless them. So, what we need to do is we need to serve a country that needs the answers that we have. So that's the biggest difference. When you accept the restrictions of the Affordable Care Act, there are several in there, some of which I think are just outright unconstitutional. But one is that you have to be able to sign the statement of faith of these existing groups. A second is that you had to have been in existence in 1999. Well, since when does the government say that because you happen to exist in 1999, you're legitimate, but if you exist in 2000, you're not? That's so arbitrary. It's just absurd. And it's also highly anti-competitive. So, we and many others are involved in trying to see those laws change. But, we also have to live with the constraints of that. So actually here in Arizona, I don't think I'm getting it wrong. I think it was in this state earlier this year. I think there was a bill trying to bring that 1999 provision into the safe harbor that exists in Arizona for this type of approach. And we had to fight against it to prevent it coming in. Maybe it wasn't, Arizona, maybe it was some other state. But, these are the sort of restrictive practices that, why would politicians get involved in that? I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. We live in a free country. If people want to innovate, if they, so here in 2014, when we started, why shouldn't we start? If a new group wants to start next year in 2022, God bless them. I hope they do really well because the country's so big. We've got plenty of room for everybody. Let's not be anti-competitive. Let's welcome competition because we want to change the whole system. Do we take the silence as silence is golden? And we should. Thank you very much. It's been a real delight being here with you. So thank you for the privilege.
Thank you.